Yeah, I agree with what Elizabeth was saying in that prayer, just that we would come and we can set the tone for the whole day, declaring that we follow a God who will not fail. And I trust that you have felt him and seen him and heard him meeting you this week. Happy Friday, everybody. Good to be back. Good to be kind of at the end of the week. And I know there have been a lot of things for you this week that are probably different than your normal week. Many, many things. But one of those, I would venture to guess, is that you watched a lot less TV than usual. Yeah. But I want to talk about TV characters as we get started here. It seems like there's a certain kind of TV character that's memorable in part because of a thing that is true of them. It is this category of character, the one that I'm thinking about, where they're good and they're also not good. Do you know what I'm talking about? Those kind of characters. They're good people, but the way that their goodness plays out is not always good to the people around them. I'm going to show you what I mean. This guy, Dwight Schrute, he's good. He knows all the rules. He knows how to make sure we're following the regulations, and he also makes us laugh, so that's fun. But he is just a thorn in the side to everyone around him, right? Because they are annoyed by him. He's so self-righteous. He's good, but not good. Here's one of my favorites that falls into this category. Monica Geller from Friends. She is good. She is obsessed with being right. She is obsessed with everything being clean, right? And in all of that, she's a little judgy about the people who aren't that way. Hence this meme, not just clean, Monica clean. And then one more, just going all the way back to my childhood, Mrs. Olson. Mrs. Olson from Walnut Grove, Little House on the Prairie. She's good. I mean, she contributes to her community. She is a good businesswoman. She cares about the right way to do things, but she's mean. Yeah? She's mean. And all three of these characters, they're right. You know, they bring something that their world needs, but they're not very good to the people around them. And that's a little bit of what I want to talk about this morning, because as Jesus followers, we bring something that our world desperately needs. But I wonder how we're doing at being good to the people in the world. As believers, our reputation right now, unfortunately, is that we aren't so good. If we're honest, the overarching narrative about the church, kind of by the everyday person, is what? That the church is judgmental, that it's hypocritical, that it's narrow-minded. And I'd even go kind of one step further and say it's not just those outside of the church that are saying these things about us, but it's often what we see in each other. Doesn't take us much. We don't have to go back that long to think back about COVID and how it was kind of embarrassing how much we as churches were pointing the finger at other churches. Not the finger, but a finger. I mean, maybe the finger. I don't know. You know, you have a church on one side of town that looks at another church on the other side of town and calls them a sellout or says that they're leading by fear because they didn't stop meeting during the shutdown and they didn't require masks when it was time to gather back. And then in turn, that church body looks back at the other church and says, oh, they're not being loving enough. They're not willing to wear masks to protect someone else, or they're not being mindful of the community that they're in because they met in person. There was a lot of finger pointing and disunity in that time. And by the way, that very reason is why there are, did you know, over 45,000 different Christian denominations in the world. Did you know that? 45,000. Back in 1800, there were 500. 500. It grew to 39,000 by 2008. And next year, the estimate would be that we would be up to 55,000 different denominations. Gordon Conwell Seminary estimates that a new Christian denomination is formed, get this, every 10 and a half hours. So every day, 2.3 new denominations are formed. Just in the week we've been here, lots of new denominations have given birth. It's about 2.3 a day. And why? Why is all of this? Just because of our disputes, our differences of how to be in the world. Oh, we interpret the Bible differently. Oh, I better go start my own church. I can't worship with you anymore because we land differently in an understanding of what the Bible says about any given topic. I'm going to move away and start my own denomination. And with all of that, what has happened is that Christians, believers, we have become known more for what we're against than what we're for. And where this gets really problematic is not even so much about when it's a right and wrong thing, but when it is about how we go about solving problems. Like, how are we going to solve the problem of homelessness? You think this, you think this. How do we solve the problem of crime? What does reconciliation look like? I mean, if you got 100 Christians in a room, I mean, we've sort of got more than that right now, you would probably find 100 different ways of defining what it is to be bringers of goodness in this world. And if you think about it, much of the political divide in our country is an argument about who is like gooder. You know, like this group over here, they believe that they're gooder because they want to let more people into our country. And this group over there, they believe that they're more gooder because they want to stem the tide of illegal immigration. You've got believers who are living out what they think is good and all the while condemning other believers for doing what they have determined is good. See, we are people of grace, but we are not always good. We're people who are right with God, but we're not always good. And if I can just pause for a second, just to call out how complicated this is, because yesterday was all about grace. Right? We talked about how grace is God's gift to you. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to strive for it. He accepts you. He approves you through Jesus. But we are also holding that tension of what it means to be people who are good. Not because we're trying to earn any favor with God or impress each other like we talked about, but because we are God's people. Because we are filled with his Spirit, and we know that God is the source of all good things. So it makes sense that that's got to come through us. But if each of us is living in the Spirit, and then as we live in the Spirit, we come to different conclusions about what it is to be good, then how do we know? How do we figure it out? So that we who are people of grace are also people who are good. What I'd like to do in this last time that we have together is I want to look at a passage. And in this passage, we're going to pull out what I would call sort of 3 tests. 3 ways that you can test to evaluate how are you doing at living in grace while you are also living out goodness. And what I'd ask of you, just in light of everything I've said so far, is that you would set aside, as much as you're able to, your personal ideas about goodness. My hope is that you can come to this passage with humility and with openness and just listening for how God might speak. The Galatians that we talked about yesterday, they struggled with this same question. How do we know what good is? See, they were in conflict as a church with each other over what it looked like for them to live out their faith. Some felt that there should be outward practices, rituals, things that stemmed back from the law that should be part of how they live out their faith. And others didn't believe that as new believers in Jesus, that needed to be part of it. So there were two problems going on in this church. One, they disagreed about how to be good. And two, in their disagreement, they did not treat each other very well. That sound a little bit familiar? So Paul, he gives them some really specific markers for what it looks like to be good to each other. So I'm going to read the whole chunk that we're going to look at today. It's a little bit long. I'm going to be reading out of the NIV. This is Galatians chapter 6. We're going to put it up here as well. And it starts like this in verse 1. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you too may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Skipping to verse 7, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Last verse. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. All right, that was a lot. There is a lot in there. And like I said, we're going to pull some stuff out. So we're going to go all the way back to verse 1 that says this. Can we read verse 1 together? Do I have that on the slide, or can we back up? Here it is. Brothers, here we go. Ready? Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. That's far enough. Restore that person gently. So this first test is this. The test of goodness is that we restore the rejected. Can you say that with me? Restore the rejected. Now, this is talking about someone who has sinned, someone who has failed in some way, maybe someone who is living in the consequences of their decisions that they have made. And there's a sense of us that's like, well, they're living in the consequence, but that is what this verse is talking about. And it's saying, restore them. What the Spirit empowers you to do in response to that person is to restore them. Now, I got to be honest, I think we live in a time right now where restoring people is almost a little taboo. I mean, we live in a cancel culture that seems like someone can do a lot of things right, and once they do one thing wrong or say one thing or have an inappropriate thing that doesn't seem socially acceptable, suddenly they're boycotted, right? They're ostracized. So this idea of restoring, going to them, bringing them back gently feels really counterculture for us right now. This word restore, it's the word katartizo, and what it specifically means is to restore someone back to what they were meant to be. Isn't that a cool image? Don't just bring them back and be like, well, we accept you. We're going to still judge you a little, but you can be with us. It's restore them back to their full potential. Goodness says that even when someone has sinned, they can be restored. Can you think of the last time you did that for someone? Can you think of anyone you know who has failed and been rejected by the church or by their family, by something in their life that you gently, as the verse says, restored them back to what they were meant to be? And can we just talk a little bit about how hard that is to do in practice, especially if it's someone close to you, especially if it's part of your family? I have one older full brother. I have two stepbrothers and a half sister who's 22. That's my family. It's a typical American family. And My older brother, ever since I can remember, has always struggled. He's if you're supposed to go this way, he goes this way. If the rule is this, he does this. And that has played out in his life. About 2 years ago, my husband and I made our way to Folsom Prison because he was getting released after 6 years. That was his third time in prison. And he was 50 years old, and he got in our car, and we talked, and he talked about how excited he was about making a new start. But man, I'd heard that before. And he was hopeful, and he was positive, and I'd seen that before. But at the same time, I knew that I wanted to be there for him. How do we hold hope with knowing that we've seen this before? And so as we talked, we planned and we dreamed about how I could support, how our family could come alongside and support him and be checking in with him. And as much as we tried to do that, I feel like I failed in that a lot. Now, the good news is he's doing okay. And there have been times where I've had to kind of talk him off the ledge a little bit. And so I know that God has used me to help restore him, but mostly I sort of feel like I've failed him a little. It's hard to restore people. It's hard work, especially if they're close to you. For you sitting here, maybe somebody comes to mind. As you think about what it is to restore the rejected, is there something specific God might be spurring in you to do for that person, with that person, to help bring them back to what they were meant to be? Do they just need some support that you are uniquely designed to give? Maybe you're somebody who's more mature in your faith and you can sort of bring them along. You could mentor them a little bit. Maybe you have financial resources that would be of help to them. These are just ideas. Like I said yesterday, you've got to talk with God and see, what is he asking you to do? Is somebody coming to mind for you? This next test that we see in the passage to determine how goodness can play out in our lives is in the very next verse. Verse 2, it says this: carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. This test asks, how are you doing at bearing someone else's burden? Now, this one's a little bit different than restoring. The idea here is to be being good toward the person who's carrying a heavy load. That might be grief or loss, like we talked about a couple days ago. That might be fear, trauma, anxiety, sadness. What good thing can you do in someone's life to help lighten their load? I have a friend who's going through a pretty messy separation that's leading to divorce, and we were wanting to get together, and the only time that we could do it was on a Sunday afternoon. Now, let me tell you how it is for pastors who preach on Sunday and what they want their Sunday afternoon to look like. It is the most straight line they can get to the couch so they can watch Friends and Little House on the Prairie and The Office. They want to just go and lay down and relax. But my friend needed me. And so we got up early Sunday morning. We did both of our services. I changed out of my clothes that I taught in, and I changed into my walking clothes, and we walked just right around the church. And near our church, there's kind of some development that's happening. So there's a sidewalk, but there's nothing else really happening. Just a lot of weeds and dirt. It's gorgeous. And as we kind of got into that part of our walk, and she's sharing with me how bad it has gotten. They're still living in the same house right now, kind of on 2 separate floors, and it's getting bad. And she told me what kinds of things he's said to her, that he hates her, that he's never loved her, that when he compares her to the other women he has slept with during their marriage, that she doesn't measure up. And then he spit on her. And she's telling me this and just bawling, cannot catch her breath. And we're standing there on this sidewalk with weeds all around that the metaphor is not lost on me. And all I could do was just hold her, standing there by the side of the road, just hold her. Often when we are called to share someone's load, we maybe hesitate because we don't know that we're equipped to do it, because we want to fix it. But sometimes, you guys, sometimes goodness is just being present to hold somebody, to listen, to make sure that they know they are not alone. Who in your life right now is carrying a burden that you could lighten in some way? That's what goodness is. Now, toward the end of our passage, we find this third test, something for us to aim at when it comes to living out goodness. This is what it says in verse 10. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Can we read that last part together? Especially to those who belong to the family of believers. This third test is simply this: be generous with those who disagree with you. Be generous toward those with whom you disagree. This is such a good reminder for us. Like we said, it's no secret that our country is very divided, and unfortunately, that includes people of faith. I know some very sincere, Bible-believing Christians who land very differently than I do on any number of issues, political and theological. And to be honest, sometimes it's everything I can do when I see them post something or say something to just keep my mouth shut. But this idea to extend generosity to them, that's where only the goodness of the Spirit in us can do. Paul says, as you have opportunity, be good to each other, especially to your brothers and sisters in Christ. How can you get better at being good to other believers? I want you to be thinking about believers who you disagree with on things, who are not in your one of 45,000 denominations that we are in. I guarantee you've got believers in your life who don't agree with you on everything. They might not vote the same way you do, or do church the way you do, or even interpret the Bible the way you do. And all these differences, in the very least, can make us feel unsupported. But what they can also do is villainize us, cause problems, cause blame and contention. So as you think about what it is to be generous with somebody that you disagree with, I want to ask you, how might you put goodness toward them? I want to give you an idea. When you go home, or maybe here, maybe you've met someone that you disagree with here, even here. What would it be for you to find another believer with whom you disagree with about something that is meaningful to you, about your faith, and you have a conversation with them? And the goal, this is the most important part, the goal is so that you can better understand them, so that you can understand why do they believe the way they do. It is not for you to convince them of why your way is right. It is not a chance to debate with them or argue with them or try to win the discussion. It is truly space set aside to listen, to try to understand, to try to see things from their perspective. This is how you can be generous toward people, even when you disagree with them. The onus is not on you to try to fix everybody around you or to get them to believe the way you do. What if we step into an open and attentive conversation that says, help me understand why your faith, that I know is genuine, leads you in such a different way than me. Help me understand that. What would that be? That would be sowing goodness, sowing generosity, even when people disagree with you. Here's what we know. Grace, like we talked about yesterday, is permanent. It means that we have the freedom from any compulsion to have to perform a certain way for God's approval. And living in that freedom, you know what that freedom really is? It is freedom to choose. We get to choose, will we live in the Spirit or will we live in our flesh? That is the choice that we have. And whichever choice we make, we still have the vest, but there is a choice in front of us. I want to look at a couple of verses that we skipped to talk about this a little bit more. Verse 7 says this, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whatever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life." And then he says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." For you, as you think about these three tests for how you are doing at being good in the world, you might be sitting here thinking like, I'm doing pretty good. I'm doing all three of those things. I'm restoring people. I'm sharing in the burden. I'm generous with people who disagree with you. Or maybe you're like, I got two of them, two out of three. That's pretty good, not bad. But see, isn't there another problem with this verse as we read it? Don't you feel sometimes like you're not reaping a harvest, though? Like he said that you will? You're hearing verses about this harvest that you will reap, but you're thinking, I'm not seeing a lot of results from all this goodness that I'm putting out. Sometimes I'm putting out goodness in the world again and again. I am being faithful. I am choosing the Spirit, but I'm not seeing a lot of results. Anybody feel that way? And I get that. And we don't like it when we don't see results. It's not very motivating. Like, it doesn't help us keep going when we don't see results. This is how I feel about physical therapy. Has anybody had to do physical therapy? Like, it's so hard to be motivated because they're like, do these 87 times a day. And if you do them faithfully 87 times a day, they're only going to take you 5 minutes. They never take 5 minutes. Then, in 6 months, you'll probably feel better. Like, that's not super motivating. We are not motivated by that. My college roommate went on to become a physical therapist. And after doing that for about 15 years, she changed and she went a very different direction and she became a canine physical therapist. Did you know that that was a thing? She became a dog physical therapist. And when I talked to her about why, like, that's a big shift. Like, why did she do that? She was like, the human patients don't do the work. But she said, if you're serious enough to bring your dog to physical therapy and to pay for your dog to have physical therapy, guess what's going to happen? Those exercises are going to happen. That's what's going to happen. See, when we do good, of course we want to see results from it. And sometimes we do get to see it, but sometimes we don't. Like any of you that have ever packed a shoebox for Operation Christmas Child, oh, that's good. It's so good, but you don't get to see what happens. When my older daughter, the one who's a counselor over at Pondy this year, when she was in middle school, we said to her, any kid you invite to go to church on Wednesday night, we will pick them up wherever they live and we'll take them. And then we'll come back and get them all and we'll drop them all back off. And that mattered because we wanted to do everything we could to make a way for them to be with Jesus, to hear about Jesus, to be with other people who would be Jesus to them. Now, did that land? Did fruit come of that? I don't know. But I still am glad that I did it. I hope the experience mattered. I believe it did, but do I see the fruit? That's not in my control. Maybe for you, you've made sacrifices for someone, a friend or someone in your family, and you're doing it to make a positive impact on them, but they might not even appreciate what you're doing. They might even resent you for it. You're doing it out of the goodness of your heart, and it is not landing. You're not seeing the fruit. You are sowing this goodness into the soil, and sometimes it just feels like it gets lost in the soil. Where did it go? Back in 2004, 20 years ago, there was an 84-year-old woman named Mary Grams, and she loved working out in her garden, and she would do that often on the kind of farm property that she lived on. And one day she was out there, and she was just working and weeding and planting and doing all the things. And about an hour in, she looked down and realized that her wedding ring was gone. And it hit her. It's in this soil somewhere. And so she spent another hour digging for it and looking for it, and she never found it. And she decided that she would not tell her husband. She just went and bought a ring that looked slightly similar, and he didn't even notice. Shocking, right? Maybe you feel like you are sowing valuable, precious, unique things into the soil, and you are not getting any harvest back. I'm sure that all of us here go to very loving churches, and yet our world is full of hateful rhetoric. I believe that we have a desire and we move toward being a light in the world, and yet our world feels darker than ever right now. So when we read this line that says, we will reap a harvest, just don't give up, it makes us ask, where? When? I don't see this harvest. And Paul says, don't lose steam when it comes to goodness. I know you're not seeing an immediate result, but rest assured you will. Eventually. And we want that. We want to have a result right away. We like things to work in a formulaic way. If I have a mean neighbor and I keep being nice to them, I want them to eventually become a nice neighbor. But if you know about Mrs. Olson, you know that that is never going to happen. It's not always true. The formula isn't working. We know from experience that we don't always see the difference that we make when we bring something good. And then we see this verse, and it says, thank you for that soundtrack, we will reap a harvest. Well, here is the deeper truth in that verse that I want to leave you with this week. I don't want you to miss that. Listen to this. Something good always comes from goodness. Something good always comes from goodness. Now, I know you're thinking, wait, didn't we just say a whole thing about how we don't always see it? We don't always know if something good comes. And yes, that's true. We don't always know out there if anything is happening. We don't always see external results, but there are internal results that occur in us when we practice goodness. This passage says, make no mistake, God will not be mocked. You will reap what you sow. If you reap in the flesh, if you sow in the flesh, you will reap destruction. If you sow in the spirit, you will reap. This is what it says in this translation, which is the Passion Translation. If you plant the good seeds of spirit life, you will reap the beautiful fruits that grow from the everlasting life of the Spirit. There will be a harvest. What you plant, you will harvest. Paul writes, if you are planting spirit-filled seeds, there will be fruit, everlasting fruit that comes. In other words, no matter what you see out there, there is internal working happening in you through the Spirit. And what that does, the output, is it changes you. So when you choose goodness, the fruit of goodness, the fruit of the Spirit grows in you. So what I want you to see today is that something good always comes from goodness. But that good thing, it might be something God's doing in you. See, we've been looking sometimes in the wrong places to see the harvest. Yes, we hope we get to see that fruit. That is so encouraging and affirming when we do. But even when you don't, you are guaranteed a spiritual harvest in your life. And it makes you be able to live even more abundantly in God's rich grace for you. When you believe in a supernatural God, if we say we believe in a supernatural God, that means that we have to believe that there are divine mysteries. There are very real things that happen in our world and in our life that we cannot always explain. And somehow, in God's divine economy, the actions that we do change us. But it doesn't always feel very tangible or immediate, and we don't like that, right? But if we again and again can choose goodness and you keep doing it over and over again, one day, your kid will do something that they know they shouldn't do, and you have had many conversations with them about why they shouldn't do it. And that day, you will respond with kindness. And you won't know where it came from, but it's in you. And one day, when you are feeling like maybe you find out about somebody that needs something, you find out about a burden, and maybe it's something that they got themselves into the mess. And when you hear that one day, instead of judgment rising up in you, or instead of apathy, compassion will rise up in you. And you're not going to know where it came from, but then you're going to know where it came from. And one day you're going to be experiencing so much stress, so much chaos in your life. Things will seem to be unraveling, and yet somehow you feel peace at your core. And you will know when that happens that you are changing, that the Spirit is growing in you. You might not be able to mark when it happens, but you will be able to experience the harvest of this fruit if you keep sowing seeds of goodness. God is always doing something in you every time you sow goodness, even when you can't see it. I told you about Mary Graham's and her ring lost in the soil. Fast forward 13 years. At this point, Mary now lived in an older community, but her son and her daughter-in-law, they lived in the farm where she lost that ring. And one day they were thinking about what they wanted for dinner, and they decided they wanted a salad. And so they went out to the garden and they gathered up some carrots, and they brought in those dirty, gnarly carrots, and they put them on the side of the sink. And as they began to wash those carrots and get them ready for salad, they found this. In the soil, that ring sat. Years and years went by. And eventually, something started to be formed and to be changed because of what was in the soil. It is in the secret place. It is in a hidden place, but something was growing there just like it is in you. And that something is shaped by what you have sown into the soil. I want you to think about what you're sowing as we talked about these three things. Are you sowing the goodness that restores someone who has fallen, who has failed, who's failed you? Are you restoring? Is that part of what you're sowing? Are you bearing someone's burden? Are we being generous with people, especially those that we disagree with? As we close, I want to ask you to, let's just close our eyes, and I want to just give space for the Holy Spirit. Maybe a face is coming to mind for you. Maybe a name. Maybe this name keeps popping up and you keep trying to push it down because you know what it requires. Could it be that in this moment, on a Friday morning at Mount Hermon, God is calling you to continue sowing goodness, to look for the harvest? I'm going to give you just a moment to be talking to God, and then I want to just close with a blessing over you. I pray that the God who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Amen.